The world we once knew is no more. What began as a hopeful pursuit for cures, innovation, and progress became humanity's undoing. Elijah Carr, a brilliant biochemist, unknowingly ignited the catastrophic event that spiraled into the apocalypse. A cure that was meant to save lives instead brought destruction. Now, survivors like me, Joe Henry, are left to navigate the ruins, searching for truth in a world of lies. The virus, the monsters it created, and the twisted motives behind it all have left us broken. But in this chaos, one question remains. Can we find redemption before it's too late? Elijah Carr was a mind ahead of his time, one whose curiosity and brilliance would have led him to greatness. In college, he wasn't just another student. He was a force of nature, known simply as Eli to those who were closest to him. His eccentricity was legendary. He scribbled on napkins, scribbled on scraps of paper, ideas, breakthroughs, and concepts that no one else could quite grasp. His thoughts went beyond the norm, exploring areas that others in his field wouldn't dare touch, curing diseases, reversing cellular decay, and even the possibility of extending human life. These weren't just dreams to Elijah, they were achievable goals. However, for all his genius, Elijah was also deeply empathetic. He wasn't like the other scientists who saw human lives as mere data points. He had a heart, and it broke when his mother passed away due to a rare genetic disease. Her death didn't just affect him emotionally, it ignited a fire within him. He swore that he would dedicate his life to curing diseases like the one that took her from him. That dedication brought him to GenX Dynamics, a cutting-edge biotech company known for its groundbreaking research. Little did he know, the very company he believed in would lead to his undoing. GenX had been working on something called Regenesis, a project that seemed like the pinnacle of medical advancement. The idea was revolutionary. A virus that could invade damaged cells, repair them, and leave without a trace. A virus that could heal, not harm. Elijah saw the potential for humanity's future, a future where diseases like his mother's could be eradicated. But as he dug deeper, he realized that GenX had its own agenda. The company didn't want to cure diseases. They wanted to create weapons. The Regenesis project was not just about healing, it was about weaponizing viruses, crafting tools of mass destruction disguised as cures. At first, Elijah didn't believe it. He thought he must have been misinterpreting the data. But the more he learned, the more he saw the truth. And the truth was terrifying. The virus they were developing wasn't going to save anyone. It was going to spread rapidly, adapt in ways that no human could predict, and become an unstoppable force of chaos. By the time Elijah figured this out, it was too late. His research had already been repurposed for darker purposes, and the first human trials had begun. Elijah walked into the lab one day to find dozens of test subjects strapped to gurneys, writhing in agony as the virus took hold. Their screams echoed in his mind, a haunting reminder of the horror his work had become. He fled that day, but not for long. His conscience wouldn't let him run forever. He knew that if GenX kept going, the virus would escape containment and the consequences would be catastrophic. But Elijah wasn't a coward. He chose to return to the very place he had fled. He volunteered to become a test subject, not to cure himself, but to prove that the virus was too unstable for human use. They called him Subject Zero after that. Elijah Carr injected himself with the first live strain of the virus, fully aware of the risks, hoping that his sacrifice would stop the madness before it was too late. At first, it seemed like Elijah had been right. The virus wreaked havoc on his body, causing seizures, hallucinations, and rapid cell decay. It was exactly what he had predicted. But then something unexpected happened. Elijah's body didn't succumb to the virus. It adapted. His cells began to repair themselves. His mind started to heal in ways no one had ever seen. The virus didn't kill him, it changed him, transforming him into something else entirely. The scientists were overjoyed, thinking they had found the perfect virus. But for Elijah, it was the beginning of a nightmare. He realized that what had happened to him wasn't a cure. It was a curse. And before the scientists could continue their experiments, the outbreak began. Whether by accident or design, the virus spread beyond containment and the world would never be the same again. Elijah Carr, once the savior of humanity, became the man who unknowingly started the apocalypse. And now, as the world burns, his story is one of the most tragic ironies of all. The man who wanted to save the world had, in the end, destroyed it. Elijah Carr's transformation was not instantaneous. It was gradual, insidious, and ultimately irreversible. When he volunteered to become a test subject, he did not expect to survive. In fact, he had hoped the virus would destroy him, taking with it the guilt he felt for what he had unleashed. But the virus didn't kill him. It rewired his very essence. For the first few days, Elijah was racked with pain. His body burned with fever, his mind fractured by seizures, and his once sharp thoughts became tangled in a haze of hallucinations. The scientists watched in awe as the virus ravaged him in ways they had predicted. Yet, despite the overwhelming damage, something extraordinary began to happen. Elijah's body didn't give in. His cells didn't deteriorate. They regenerated. The damage that the virus had done to his system reversed itself. At first slowly, then at an accelerated pace. The virus adapted not only to his body, but to his mind. His thoughts cleared. The hallucinations stopped. His seizures became less frequent. Where there had been a fragile man on the brink of death, now stood someone different. Something different. The transformation was horrifying. Elijah no longer looked like the man he once was. His skin took on an almost ethereal quality, with veins pulsing beneath the surface like glowing blue wires. His once bright eyes, filled with empathy and curiosity, became cold, distant, almost alien. The virus had altered his brain, leaving him with memories, emotions, and a fragmented sense of self that no longer fit with the body he inhabited. To the scientists observing him, Elijah was a miracle. Subject Zero, they called him. The first successful subject to not only survive but thrive. They marveled at how his body rejected the virus's destructive effects, not just tolerating the infection, but using it to heal itself in ways they had never imagined. They saw him as the key to their ultimate goal, a perfect virus that could cure disease, extend life, and potentially become a weapon of unimaginable power. But for Elijah, it was a nightmare. He didn't feel like a hero. He felt like an abomination. The first time Elijah saw himself in a mirror after the transformation, he barely recognized the face staring back at him. His reflection seemed distant, as if it was a stranger inhabiting his body. He was still Elijah in name, but not in essence. The virus had taken away everything that made him human, replacing it with something else entirely, something that he couldn't control. As his body adapted, so too did his mind. Elijah's once unshakable sense of right and wrong began to fray. The empathy he had once felt for others was clouded by a growing sense of detachment. He no longer felt the same grief over his mother's death or the same drive to cure the diseases that had taken her from him. In fact, he felt little at all. It was as if the virus had stripped away the parts of him that had once made him care. Yet, despite the growing emptiness within him, there was still a flicker of Elijah, the man who had once wanted to heal the world. It was that flicker that led him to make a decision no one could have predicted. He knew that the virus was too unstable to be used. He had witnessed firsthand what it had done to him, and he could see the damage it was causing in the lab's other subjects. But instead of running, instead of disappearing into the world where he might have found some semblance of peace, Elijah made a desperate choice. He returned to the lab, knowing that if the virus was left unchecked, it would inevitably escape containment and spread beyond control. He volunteered again, this time to make the ultimate sacrifice. He injected himself with a stronger strain, hoping to prove its dangers to the world. But when the virus entered his bloodstream, it didn't just make him sick, it rewrote him completely. It was no longer just a virus. It was evolution, a force that could not be stopped. Elijah's decision to expose himself to the virus made him the perfect test subject, but it also made him the catalyst for something far worse. What was supposed to be a controlled experiment spiraled out of control. The virus didn't just take over his body, it hijacked his very existence. And in doing so, it created something far more dangerous than anyone could have imagined. The man who had once tried to save the world was now part of the apocalypse. The legend of Subject Zero had begun. Elijah Carr, the biochemist who had once sought to cure the world, was now its harbinger of destruction, and the world was about to pay the price. The outbreak began in small, isolated pockets. It started slow, like a whisper that no one could quite hear. But whispers can grow louder, can spread until they become a deafening roar. The first reports of strange, violent outbreaks were dismissed as rumors or the work of overzealous conspiracy theorists. People didn't want to believe it, not until they had to. And by the time they had no choice, it was already too late. Adam Cross, a journalist with a passion for uncovering hidden truths, was among the first to notice something wasn't right. Adam had always been a seeker of stories, a man who looked beyond the surface to find the truth buried beneath layers of media manipulation and corporate lies. It was how he first stumbled upon Gen X dynamics, while investigating shady dealings in the pharmaceutical industry. He thought they were just another greedy corporation, cutting corners to maximize profit, but Adam didn't know the half of it. Gen X wasn't just a corporation, it was a ticking time bomb, one that would eventually destroy the world. Adam's world shattered the day he turned on the news to see people in the streets, writhing in pain, convulsing uncontrollably, and collapsing to the ground. At first, it didn't make sense. It was as if something out of a horror film was unfolding in real life, but it wasn't a movie, it was reality. Adam watched the footage in disbelief, still holding on to the faint hope that it was some kind of media exaggeration. But then the reports began to come from his own city. Hospitals were overwhelmed, emergency services were flooded with victims, but no one seemed to know how to contain it. By the time Adam reached his newsroom, the panic had already set in. The phone lines were down, the internet was slow, and the power flickered ominously. The emergency broadcast system took over, giving vague instructions about sheltering in place and avoiding infected zones, but nothing was ever clear. Adam stayed at his desk, trying to make sense of the unfolding chaos until the unthinkable happened. A man, bloodied and disoriented, burst through the newsroom door. Adam's colleagues tried to help him, but before anyone could react, the man lunged, attacking one of them. The newsroom erupted into chaos. Panic set in. Adam didn't think. He ran. The world that Adam had known, the world where he had once believed in the power of truth and journalism to make a difference, collapsed in front of him. People weren't just dying. They were being consumed, infected, transformed into something grotesque. The cities were no longer safe. Once bustling streets teeming with life became empty wastelands. It wasn't just the infected that posed a threat. It was the people themselves. Desperation turned neighbor against neighbor. The survival instinct, which once united humanity, now tore it apart. People looted stores, fighting for whatever resources they could find. Law enforcement was overwhelmed, and the military, ill-prepared and scattered, struggled to maintain order. Adam fled the city, his heart heavy with the loss of his colleagues, his dog Daisy, and his belief that the world could be saved. His only hope now was survival, and he had no clear plan for what came next. As he wandered the empty streets, Adam began to see the scale of the destruction. Buildings were crumbling, streets were filled with wreckage, and the air was thick with smoke from fires that seemed to rage without end. The city had turned into a war zone, but there was no war, only chaos. He stumbled through the city for days, unsure of where to go. His mind was reeling. Everywhere he looked, he saw the broken pieces of the world he had known, a world of civilization, technology, and progress. and now in its place there was only destruction. He found his way to the outskirts of the city, where he remembered an old friend, a doomsday prepper, had once set up a fallout shelter. His friend had always warned him about the end of the world, and Adam had laughed it off as paranoia. But now, Adam was forced to eat his words. When Adam reached the shelter, he found it as his friend had left it, well-stocked, secure, and ready for a crisis. But his friend was gone, leaving behind only a trail of blood and an empty shelter. Adam was alone. The world outside was falling apart, and all he could do was sit in the darkness with only the faint hum of his radio for company. It was there in the isolation that he made his choice. He would no longer just survive, he would document, he would broadcast the truth about what had happened, hoping that someone somewhere would hear him and understand. And so Adam began to broadcast. He set up his old ham radio and started transmitting, telling stories of the chaos and destruction that had engulfed the world. His broadcast became a lifeline for those who were still alive, those who still held on to hope that somehow they could rebuild. But as the weeks wore on, Adam realized that his broadcasts weren't just about survival anymore. They were about keeping humanity's memory alive, even in the face of overwhelming despair. The virus had done its worst. Cities were abandoned, societies fractured, and the survivors were left to pick up the pieces. Adam's broadcasts were a reminder that even in the darkest moments, there was still a spark of hope. But the question remained, how long could hope survive in a world that had forgotten how to live? As Adam spoke into the microphone, he knew that the world had already changed forever. But he also knew that there was still a chance for the truth to be heard, a chance for humanity to rise again. Whether that hope would be enough, he didn't know. But for now, it was all he had left. And as long as he could speak, he would continue to broadcast. Because in a world without order, without law, and without mercy, Adam Cross knew one thing. Hope was a powerful weapon, and it was the only thing that could keep them all from falling into complete darkness. The Red Horizon Protocol was born out of desperation. When the virus first began to spread, it was clear that no one had expected it to be this devastating. Governments scrambled for a solution, each more fearful than the last. At first, they tried containment quarantines, travel restrictions, and military blockades. But those measures proved useless against an enemy that could slip through cracks, adapt, and outpace their efforts. As the virus spread like wildfire, entire cities fell, their populations swallowed by the infected. Desperation set in, and that's when the Red Horizon Protocol was conceived. It wasn't meant to be a first line of defense, it was always a last resort. Or at least that's what they wanted everyone to believe. Officially, the protocol was a classified contingency plan, a measure of last resort in the event that a city became overrun. The idea was simple. If a city could no longer be contained, it would be eradicated completely irrevocably. No evacuations, no attempts to save the population. It was a scorched earth policy. If the virus couldn't be stopped, the only solution was to erase everything, to ensure the infection wouldn't spread any further. The military was tasked with carrying out this operation, using any means necessary: airstrikes, firebombs, and even nuclear weapons. The justification: the loss of a few million lives was a small price to pay to save the rest of the world. To them, it wasn't about saving lives, it was about preventing the total collapse of civilization. They thought they could contain the infection by making entire cities vanish from the map. When Adam Cross first learned of the Red Horizon Protocol, it came through an intercepted military transmission. He was holed up in his fallout shelter trying to make sense of the chaos around him when he stumbled across an old, beat-up radio. Its signal was weak, but it was enough to catch fragments of a chilling conversation between two soldiers. The voices trembled with fear, unsure of their orders. They were questioning the legitimacy of what they were being asked to do. One soldier even dared to ask why they were targeting civilians, why they couldn't find another way. The answer was chilling: execute. The transmission ended abruptly, replaced by the sound of distant explosions. Adam sat in stunned silence, realizing that the military had already begun carrying out the protocol. The destruction wasn't some far-off nightmare. It was happening now. The protocol had been activated. Over the coming days, Adam would hear more about the Red Horizon Protocol from the survivors who had managed to escape the bombed-out cities. Their stories were horrific. People describing how planes flew overhead not to offer help but to rain down destruction. Whole neighborhoods, once full of life, were now smoldering ruins. People who had sought refuge in hospitals, schools, and homes were obliterated by firebombs and the fallout from nuclear strikes. There was no distinction between the infected and the uninfected. In the eyes of those carrying out the protocol, they were all expendable. One survivor, a firefighter who had been in Los Angeles when the bombs fell, recounted the events with a haunted look in his eyes. He had been trying to rescue survivors from a collapsed building when the sirens sounded loud, blaring warnings. But these weren't the usual warnings. These were different. He described seeing a blinding flash of light and feeling the ground shake beneath his feet. When he regained consciousness, everything was gone. His team, the building, the city. Only the rubble remained. The city had been wiped out in an instant. This was the cost of the protocol. Entire cities were eradicated, not because they had fallen to the virus, but because the powers that be decided it was the only way to protect the world. And what was the result? Chaos. The bombings created more refugees, more survivors with no place to go. The virus spread further, unchecked, carried on the winds and in the blood of those fleeing the destruction. The Red Horizon Protocol didn't stop the outbreak. It accelerated. The military, of course, justified their actions. They argued that without the protocol, the entire world would have fallen to the infection, that the eradication of a few cities was necessary to ensure the survival of the rest. But Adam saw through the lies. He saw it for what it truly was, a calculated move by those in power to maintain control, to cover up their failures. The virus had slipped beyond their grasp, and instead of owning up to their mistakes, they chose to destroy entire populations to hide the truth. What was the truth? Why were certain cities targeted? Adam had begun to uncover clues that suggested something far darker than just a failed containment strategy. Some of the cities that had been bombed weren't even overrun. They were intact, their populations uninfected. So why were they destroyed? What was so dangerous that it had to be wiped from the map, along with millions of innocent lives? There were rumors, of course. Some speculated that these cities harbored secrets, evidence of the virus's true origins, or worse, proof that the outbreak was no accident. Others believed that the virus itself had been engineered in these cities, a biological weapon designed to be unleashed on the world. The more Adam dug into the origins of the Red Horizon Protocol, the more questions arose. Why had the military not just quarantined the cities like they had with others? Why had they bombed them into oblivion? The answers remained elusive, and the survivors' testimonies only deepened the mystery. In the aftermath, the government denied any wrongdoing, claiming that the protocol was necessary to prevent a global catastrophe. But Adam knew better. He knew that the Red Horizon Protocol was more than a desperate attempt to stop the virus. It was an act of betrayal. A betrayal by those in power who believed they were above accountability. The people who created this destruction weren't just trying to save the world. They were covering their own tracks, hiding the truth that could bring them down. As the world lay in ruins, Adam couldn't help but wonder, what if the Red Horizon Protocol wasn't just about containing the virus? What if it was about something much darker? Something that could change everything? Whatever the reason, the consequences were clear. The world had paid the price for the government's mistakes, and now the survivors were left to pick up the pieces. In the end, the Red Horizon Protocol didn't just destroy cities. It destroyed the last shred of trust between the people and the institutions that were supposed to protect them. The world was broken, and in the ashes of its destruction, only one thing remained certain: nothing would ever be the same again. There are places in this world that no one remembers. Places so lost, so erased, that even the most diligent of searchers won't uncover them. Some say these places never existed at all, that they were figments of imagination or bad dreams. But there's always someone who remembers, someone who knows that at one time these places were real. The Forgotten Town is one such place, a small isolated town that disappeared from the map long before the world fell apart, but whose secrets would eventually haunt those who dared to seek them. Before the outbreak, the Forgotten Town was just another dot on the map. A quiet place tucked away in the countryside, a town where life was slow, peaceful. Its name has been lost to time, as if the very mention of it has been wiped from history. People lived simple lives, and everyone knew everyone else's business. There was a diner at the corner of Main Street, a small school, and a gas station that never ran out of fuel. It was a town that had everything it needed, and nothing more. A place that seemed ordinary, almost too ordinary, and perhaps that's why it was chosen. It wasn't until after the outbreak that the town's eerie disappearance came to light. The story of what happened there is like something out of a nightmare, a tale of government secrecy, corporate experimentation, and an entire community's erasure. A man named Ezekiel was one of the few who had lived to tell the tale. He had been a teenager when everything changed. When he spoke of the Forgotten Town, his voice trembled, as though even the mere memory of it unsettled him. Ezekiel's story begins one night when he and a few friends decided to sneak out of town for a weekend camping trip. It was the summer of 2019, and the town had begun to notice a few strange things happening. It started with a few people getting sick, a few unexplained illnesses, but nothing out of the ordinary for a small town. At least, that's what everyone thought. The town's doctor had chalked it up to a flu season that had hit harder than usual. But then people started acting differently. They became violent, erratic, and some even disappeared without a trace. Ezekiel and his friends had planned to return from their trip and enjoy the last days of summer before school started again. But when they returned, nothing was the same. The streets were empty. The houses were abandoned, windows shattered or covered with grime. There were no signs of life, no people, just an overwhelming silence, and a feeling that something was terribly wrong. The air itself seemed thick with an unspoken dread, a heaviness that weighed down on their chests. The town had vanished, not just physically, but in every conceivable way. Ezekiel tried to find the familiar landmarks, the diner, the school, the gas station, but they were gone too. The buildings stood, but they were different. The signs were missing. The streets were overgrown with weeds. It was as if the entire town had been erased from existence, as if it had never been there to begin with. They left in a hurry, terrified and confused, their minds struggling to grasp what had happened. But no one would believe them. When they told the police, they were told that no such town existed. The officer looked at them like they were crazy. The authorities had no record of it, no memory of it. It was as though the Forgotten Town had never been a part of the world at all. But Ezekiel knew better. He had lived there. He knew the people, the streets, the places. But somehow the town was gone, and its name was now nothing more than a whisper in the wind, more than a whisper in the wind, more than a whisper in the wind. Ezekiel's search for answers took years. He spent his days scouring old maps, government records, anything that could provide proof that the Forgotten Town had existed. But every trace of it had been erased, as if someone had gone to great lengths to make sure no one could find it. Roads leading to the town were overgrown with trees and debris, and street signs had either been removed or defaced. The town was a ghost, a forgotten part of history that no one was allowed to remember. It wasn't until Ezekiel met others like him, survivors who had stumbled across the town and escaped before it was sealed off, that he began to piece together the truth. Some whispered that the town had been the site of a secret government experiment, one that had gone horribly wrong. Others claimed that Gen X Dynamics had set up a research facility on the outskirts of the town, using the isolation of the place to conduct experiments that no one could afford to know about. They were conducting tests on human subjects, pushing the boundaries of science, perhaps trying to create the perfect virus, one that could not be contained. Whatever happened, something catastrophic occurred. The people in the town started to change. Some became violent, attacking their neighbors, while others simply disappeared. Ezekiel told me one story he had heard from an old woman who had lived on the outskirts of the town. She had witnessed her neighbor, a sweet old woman who used to bake cookies for the children, suddenly snap. She attacked her husband with her bare hands in the middle of the night, trying to bite him. When the police arrived, they shot her. But it didn't stop her. She kept coming, even after she was shot 3 times. It wasn't an isolated incident. People started to act differently, as though they had been infected by something that changed them. The government moved in quickly, but not to help. They cordoned off the town and placed roadblocks miles from the city limits. No one was allowed in, and no one was allowed out. Family members were separated, and the people inside the town were told nothing. There were no medical supplies, no food, only soldiers with flamethrowers burning everything in their path. The quarantine wasn't about saving lives, it was about containment. And when all communication stopped, it was as though the town had been wiped off the face of the earth. But the town hadn't been forgotten by everyone. There were whispers of survivors who had managed to escape before the lockdown. A few had made it out, but they were different. They had seen things, horrible things, that they couldn't forget. They carried with them the scars of the town's dark secret. And they, like Ezekiel, spent years trying to find out what happened to the town, to the people who lived there, and to the experiment that had gone so wrong. As Ezekiel searched for answers, he came across a single clue, a rusted welcome sign, buried in the weeds just outside the town's original borders. The sign had been spray painted over, but beneath the graffiti, he could just make out the faint outline of the town's name. And that's when it hit him. Whatever happened in the forgotten town wasn't just an accident. It was deliberate. Someone had erased the town's existence, and with it, the people who lived there. What really happened to the forgotten town? Was it the epicenter of the outbreak? A failed experiment? Or was it something darker, something so terrible that the world could never know? The truth may never be uncovered. But one thing is certain. The forgotten town wasn't just erased from the map. It was buried, hidden away, never to be remembered. The survivors who escaped will never forget. And perhaps that's the most chilling part of all. Some places are meant to stay forgotten, and some truths are better left untold. The world had collapsed into chaos, and humanity had fractured into factions. Some fighting for survival, others for control. But amidst the rubble of broken cities, a flicker of defiance began to rise from the ashes. The underground resistance was born not out of ambition or power, but out of necessity, a need to fight back against the destruction caused by those who had once held the world's fate in their hands. And though their efforts were small, their message was clear. Humanity wasn't done yet. It began in the shadows, hidden from the military, the mercenaries, and even the infected. The first signs of resistance were simple. Graffiti scrolled on walls, a symbol of hope in a world that had long since abandoned it. But these whispers grew louder. Small acts of rebellion began to take shape. Food was stolen from military convoys and distributed to starving communities. Radios were hijacked to broadcast messages of defiance. People were reaching out, connecting with others who still held on to the belief that humanity could rise again. The resistance didn't start with grand plans or a well-organized force. It started with ordinary people. People who had lost everything but refused to give in. Clara Voss was one of them. Once a nurse, she had spent her life caring for others. But when the outbreak began, she saw too many lives lost due to the government's negligence and the chaos that followed. When her family was killed in the early days of the pandemic, Clara swore to fight for those who couldn't fight for themselves. Clara became the heart of the Resistance's medical division. She operated a mobile hospital deep underground, treating everyone who needed it: wounded civilians, defecting soldiers, even survivors of the experiments conducted by Gen X Dynamics. Clara wasn't just patching up bodies, she was healing souls. She reminded people that there was still kindness in the world, that compassion hadn't died with the collapse of civilization. She was a beacon of hope in a world where hope was in short supply. Marcus Kane was another vital member of the Resistance. A tech genius, Marcus had once worked for Gen X Dynamics. His knowledge of the company's inner workings made him invaluable to the Resistance. After discovering the company's role in creating the virus, Marcus disappeared, going underground. He hacked into military networks, stole classified data, and disabled drone strikes targeting Resistance outposts. His base of operations was hidden in the depths of old subway tunnels, a maze of wires and computers that had once been a part of the city's lifeline. Now it was his sanctuary, a place where he could continue the fight in silence without the eyes of the enemy on him. But the most vital role in the Resistance was Emil Stokes. Emil had lost everything in the Red Horizon bombings, the destruction of his home, his family, and his future. But rather than give in to despair, Emil channeled his grief into action. He became the voice of the Resistance, using pirate radio frequencies to broadcast their message across the wastelands. His voice, crackling through the static, became a lifeline for survivors who felt lost and alone. "You are not alone," he would say, his voice steady despite the chaos around him. Emil's broadcasts were a reminder that humanity still had a pulse, that even in the darkest times there was someone out there who cared. Together, Clara, Marcus, and Emil became the core of the underground Resistance. But they weren't the only one. The Resistance was made up of people from all walks of life: soldiers, civilians, former government officials, and even ordinary workers who had lost everything but still fought for a chance to rebuild. Their operations were as diverse as the people who made up their ranks, and they knew that every day was a battle, not just against the infected, but against the very forces that had brought the world to its knees. One of their primary missions was intelligence. The Resistance scouts moved silently through the ruins, risking their lives to gather information on infected hotspots, safe routes, and enemy movements. They mapped out the ever-changing landscape, creating a web of knowledge that helped survivors navigate the wasteland. It wasn't just about survival, it was about staying one step ahead of the enemy. But sabotage became their true weapon. The Resistance didn't just hide in the shadows. They struck when the enemy least expected it. They derailed military supply trains, destroyed Gen X research labs, and took down fortified outposts controlled by mercenary groups. Their strikes weren't random acts of violence. They were carefully planned, surgical in their execution, designed to weaken the enemy and protect the vulnerable. But despite the successes, the Resistance wasn't without its challenges. The most immediate threat came from the infected, but it wasn't just the mindless zombies that posed a danger. It was the Wardens, mutated predators that seemed to possess intelligence, speed, and organization. The Resistance had begun to notice that the Wardens were targeting them, stalking their hideouts and attempting to crush their resistance before it could grow. The infected had never been organized before, but the Wardens were different. They led groups of infected in coordinated attacks, employing tactics that no mindless creature should be capable of. Survivors began to report seeing Wardens working together, flanking Resistance outposts and using the infected as pawns in their twisted game of survival. The Resistance knew they couldn't face the Wardens head-on. They had to be smarter, more resourceful. The Wardens hunted in packs, but the Resistance was scattered, unpredictable, and that's how they survived. They learned to avoid patterns, to keep their movements erratic and hard to predict. If they stayed one step ahead, they could outwit even the most cunning predators. But the human threat was just as dangerous. Mercenary groups and warlords who saw the Resistance as a threat to their power moved in, trying to crush them. They hunted Resistance leaders, hoping to eliminate the heart of the movement. Gen X Dynamics, which had once been the source of the outbreak, had placed bounties on the heads of key resistance figures. Black Ops teams were sent into the ruins searching for any sign of resistance activity. The resistance was fighting a war on two fronts: the infected and the humans who had become just as dangerous as the virus itself. And within their ranks, there were whispers of betrayal. In a world where survival was the only rule, it was hard to trust anyone. There were spies within the resistance, individuals who fed information to the enemy, hoping to profit from the chaos. Trust became a currency, and the resistance had to be careful who they let in. But despite the dangers, the resistance endured. They adapted. They fought. They survived. One story that became legend within the resistance was about a group of survivors trapped in an infected zone. The horde was closing in, their defenses were crumbling, and they had no food or water left. Just as all hope seemed lost, a group of resistance fighters appeared, clearing a path through the infected and leading them to safety. It was an act of bravery that reminded everyone that the resistance wasn't just about survival, it was about keeping the flame of humanity alive. The resistance wasn't just about fighting, it was about hope. They distributed food, medicine, and books to isolated communities. They set up secret schools to teach children how to survive in this new world. They reminded everyone they met that humanity's story wasn't over yet, that there was still a chance to rebuild, to start anew. But the greatest threat came from within. With so many diverse people making up the ranks, it was impossible to avoid conflict. Differences in opinion, personal histories, and priorities began to tear at the seams of the resistance. Some members wanted to focus on survival, while others wanted to take the fight directly to Gen X dynamics. Some argued that the resistance should remain hidden, while others believed they had to make their presence known to inspire others. These conflicts threatened to divide them, but they couldn't afford division. The war was too important. Through it all, the underground resistance stood strong. They were not a group of superheroes or warriors. They were survivors, people who had lost everything but still fought for a better world. They were ordinary people thrust into extraordinary circumstances, and their actions would shape the course of history. They weren't just fighting for themselves, they were fighting for everyone. As the resistance continued to grow, so did their hope. The world may have been broken, but the underground resistance was proof that humanity wasn't finished. They were the spark in the darkness, and with every act of defiance, every piece of intelligence gathered, and every life saved, they brought the world one step closer to reclaiming what had been lost. For as long as the resistance existed, there would always be a chance to rebuild. As long as they fought, there was hope. And as long as there was hope, humanity could rise from the ashes. In the early days of the outbreak, humanity had learned to fear the infected. The mindless, shambling hordes that stumbled through the streets, driven by instinct and hunger, were a threat that everyone could understand. They were predictable, easy to avoid if you were careful, but then came the wardens. Something far worse. These creatures were not like the others. They were faster, stronger, and most unsettling of all. They were organized. The first reports of the wardens came from survivors in what had once been quarantine zones. People spoke of infected behaving in ways that didn't make sense, no longer acting on pure instinct but moving with purpose. They didn't charge mindlessly at their prey like the others. They waited. They watched. They learned. Some survivors described them as being almost human in their intelligence, as though they could understand the world around them, as if they were capable of planning their attacks. The stories quickly became more chilling. One woman, a doctor named Nora, had taken shelter in a fortified hospital with a group of survivors. For weeks, they thought they were safe. The hospital had strong barriers and lookout points. The infected would come, bang on the barriers for a while, then eventually retreat. It was routine, but then everything changed. Nora was on watch when she first saw them. 3 figures standing at the edge of the floodlights watching. They didn't move, they didn't make a sound, just stood there staring. At first, Nora thought it was paranoia, but the next night everything changed. The barriers, once secure, were breached. not by a mindless horde but by a coordinated attack. Doors that had been locked were now open. Fires were set in key areas, forcing the survivors into a trap. Nora barely escaped, but she was sure of what she had seen. The wardens had learned to plan, to think. The wardens were not just predators, they were tactical. They hunted like wolves, not in a frenzy but with patience. One survivor, Mayo, a former soldier, described an encounter in the forest that still haunted him. He and his group had been pursued by what they thought was a normal pack of infected, but they soon realized something was wrong. The infected weren't running straight at them, charging recklessly as usual. They were circling, were cutting off escape roads, slowly forcing the group deeper into the forest. Maddow said it was like being hunted by wolves. The wardens didn't rush them. They waited until the group was exhausted, disoriented, and surrounded. When they finally attacked, it wasn't chaotic. It was precise, ruthless. They didn't waste energy. They didn't act out of rage. They acted out of strategy. What made the wardens even more terrifying was their adaptability. It wasn't just their intelligence that set them apart. It was their ability to evolve. Some survivors believed that the wardens were a result of the virus adapting to its hosts, creating a new stage of infected. The virus had already mutated several times, but these new creatures were something entirely different. They were stronger, faster, and seemingly impervious to the weaknesses that had once made the infected vulnerable. They were no longer just mindless killers, they were a force, a new breed of predator. Others speculated that the wardens had been created on purpose. Some whispered that they were a product of the experiments carried out by Gen X Dynamics, that the company had somehow engineered them to be the ultimate weapon. Whether they were the result of a failed experiment or the virus's natural evolution, the wardens were unlike anything humanity had faced before. There were even more disturbing rumors. Survivors had reported seeing wardens wearing vests, tactical gear, as if they had once been human soldiers. Some believed that the virus had fused with the DNA of military personnel or other test subjects, giving the wardens their enhanced abilities. Others thought that the wardens were learning, evolving beyond their initial form. One survivor claimed to have seen a warden look directly at him, and for a brief moment he swore the creature understood him, as if it could read his thoughts, If these creatures were indeed evolving, it meant that humanity's place at the top of the food chain was under serious threat. The wardens were not only smarter, they were stronger and faster than any human could be. They could think and strategize, making them an entirely new kind of threat. If they started to lead the regular infected, using them as pawns in a twisted game of survival, the world would be in a far worse position than anyone had imagined. For the survivors still holding on to the hope of reclaiming some semblance of normalcy, the rise of the wardens was a game changer. It wasn't just about surviving anymore. It was about outsmarting a new kind of enemy that seemed to learn from every encounter, adapting faster than they could. So what could survivors do to avoid the wardens? The truth was, no one really knew. The best defense seemed to be unpredictability. The wardens were fast learners, and they seemed to adapt to pattern. That meant staying off the same paths, avoiding sleeping in the same spot 2 nights in a row, and being constantly aware of your surroundings. In a world where the dead walked and the living were just as dangerous, unpredictability became the key to survival. But even with these precautions, the wardens remained a constant, looming threat. They didn't just hunt, they were beginning to organize. They were planning their attacks, anticipating human movements. And what was worse, they were starting to grow in numbers. The survivors who had once been able to avoid the infected now had to face the wardens, whose methods of attack were only becoming more sophisticated with each passing day. As the wardens' presence grew stronger, the survivors realized that they weren't just fighting for their lives anymore. They were fighting for their place at the top of the food chain. If humanity didn't figure out how to stop the wardens, they would lose not just their cities, but their future. The infected, once the greatest threat to human survival, were now just a symptom of a far greater danger. The wardens, predators unlike anything the world had ever seen. The question wasn't just how to survive the outbreak, it was how to survive what the outbreak had created. And as the wardens closed in, it became clear that the struggle for survival was far from over. It had only just begun. In the midst of the apocalypse, where every day was a battle for survival, there remained a glimmer of hope. It wasn't much, but for the few who still dared to fight, it was everything. The resistance, though small and scattered, had become the last line of defense against the horrors unleashed by Genix Dynamics and the virus that had ravaged the world. They were the people who refused to accept the end, who fought not just for their own survival, but for the survival of a future they still believed in. The resistance efforts had been slow, steady, and mostly under the radar. They had no army, no power, and certainly no authority. But what they had was something far more dangerous, a shared conviction that humanity wasn't done yet. Their mission had grown over time, from simply surviving the infected to striking back against the very forces that had caused the apocalypse. They knew that their survival hinged not just on evading death, but on taking down the entities that had allowed it to spread unchecked. For the resistance leaders Clara Voss, Marcus Kane, and Emil Stokes, this fight was intensely personal. Clara had lost everything to the virus, her family, her life as a healer, but in the depths of a world plunged into darkness, she became a light for others, setting up mobile hospitals and underground bunkers and treating the wounded, the sick, and the injured. Every life she saved was a victory, a reminder that compassion still had a place in this broken world. Marcus Kane, once a brilliant tech genius at Genix Dynamics, had witnessed firsthand the corruption that lay at the heart of the corporation. After disappearing from the company's radar, he turned his skills against them, hacking into military networks, disabling drone strikes, and stealing classified information. Marcus became the unseen force behind many of the resistance successes. He provided them with intelligence, strategies, and most importantly, the tools they needed to stand against the monsters Genix had created. And then there was Emil Stokes. His grief over the loss of his family had driven him to the edge, but instead of succumbing to despair, Emil had found his voice. He used pirate radio frequencies to broadcast the Resistance's messages across the wasteland, reaching survivors who might otherwise have been lost in isolation. His broadcasts weren't just news or information, they were a lifeline. "You are not alone," he would say. "We are still here." Those words were more powerful than any weapon. They kept hope alive, even when the world seemed determined to snuff it out. Together, the three leaders, along with countless other resistance fighters, had been a thorn in the side of Genix Dynamics in the military. They had sabotaged labs, intercepted supply shipments, and uncovered hidden facilities. But despite their successes, they knew the road ahead was only going to get harder. Genix Dynamics wasn't just a corporation, it was an empire. And like all empires, it would stop at nothing to protect itself. As the resistance continued to fight on, they discovered something that could change everything. Marcus had uncovered a file buried deep within Genix's encrypted network that pointed to a hidden research facility in the heart of what had once been a thriving city. This facility, according to the files, contained research that might hold the key to reversing the effects of the virus, if not curing it entirely, at least containing it in a way that could save humanity. It was called Project Utopia. It was the very thing Genix had been working on before everything went wrong, and it was a last-ditch effort to restore humanity to its former glory. The catch: the facility was well guarded, and reaching it would be nearly impossible. The wardens, the new breed of infected, had begun to gather in the area surrounding the facility, and the resistance knew they couldn't afford to fight both the wardens and Genix's mercenaries at the same time. They needed to move quickly and decisively. If they waited too long, the facility would be lost, and so would their last hope of reversing the catastrophe. Emil was the first to volunteer for the mission. His broadcasts had inspired many to join the resistance, and now he was willing to put everything on the line to see this through. Clara, though hesitant, agreed that it was their best chance. She had witnessed the devastation of the infected, the torment of the survivors, and the suffering caused by the virus. If Project Utopia could stop the infection, even temporarily, it would give the world a fighting chance. But she knew the mission would be dangerous, perhaps suicidal. The risks were unimaginable. And Marcus, the hacker and strategist, had already begun to formulate a plan. He would guide the team through the facility's security systems, disabling alarms and opening the doors when necessary. But the operation would require a precise level of coordination, and even then, the odds were stacked against them. The wardens were closing in, and Gen X knew that the resistance would eventually make a move. Time was running out. The day of the mission came sooner than expected. The resistance had gathered every available fighter, every volunteer willing to risk their life for the chance of salvation. They knew this would be their most critical strike, and the risks were steep, but it was the only hope they had. The journey to the facility was harrowing. Every step was a calculated risk, every movement a potential death sentence. The wardens lurked in the shadows, waiting for any sign of weakness. The resistance had to stay vigilant, avoiding direct confrontation whenever possible. Marcus's plan was flawless, but there were still so many unknowns. As they approached the entrance to the facility, they encountered resistance from Gen X's mercenaries. The soldiers were well armed, and their firepower was overwhelming. But Clara, with her medical expertise, knew how to use her surroundings to her advantage. She treated the wounded with efficiency, knowing that every life saved was one more that could contribute to the mission's success. Marcus, meanwhile, had already begun his work on the facility's security system. It was a battle of wits between him and Gen X's top hackers, but Marcus was more than capable of outsmarting them. With every door that opened, the resistance pushed forward, closer to their goal. The tension was palpable, but they couldn't afford to hesitate. Each second was a ticking clock. The final confrontation took place inside the facility. The resistance fought their way through waves of guards and infected, determined to reach the heart of the project. When they finally found it, Project Utopia, they learned something that would forever change the course of their mission. The project, though promising, was not a cure. It was a containment strategy. The virus could be slowed, but not stopped. The hope that the resistance had been carrying for so long was shattered in that moment. But Clara refused to give up. She knew that even if Project Utopia was only a temporary solution, it was still the best chance they had. And so, with the last remnants of their strength, the resistance activated the facility's fail-safes. The containment protocols were put into place, slowing the spread of the virus and giving the survivors a fighting chance to rebuild. Though they had failed in their ultimate goal, they had succeeded in one key area. They had proven that hope, no matter how small, could still be the most powerful weapon in the world. And with that, the resistance walked away, battered but unbroken, knowing that they had not fought in vain. The last hope had not been the cure, but the will to keep fighting. And as long as that will burned bright, humanity would never be completely lost. The resistance had given the world something more valuable than answers. They had given it hope, and hope, as they knew, was worth more than anything. The battle for humanity's future had come down to this moment. The resistance had fought tooth and nail, pushing back against an overwhelming tide of destruction and decay. They had sabotaged Gen X Dynamics' plans, disabled military operations, and managed to keep hope alive in a world where it seemed all but extinguished. But now, everything was converging on one final confrontation, a stand that would determine whether humanity would survive or be forever consumed by the horrors they had unleashed. Clara Voss, Marcus Kane, Emil Stokes, and the rest of the resistance had come a long way, but the odds were no longer in their favor. Gen X Dynamics had regrouped, its leaders hiding in fortified bunkers while mercenaries and private armies rampaged across the ruins of the world. The Wardens, mutated creatures far more dangerous than the mindless infected, had become a growing threat, and their presence was steadily encroaching on the Resistance's strongholds. Clara had never wanted to lead a revolution. She had only wanted to heal, to save lives. But with every passing day, her role had evolved. She had become the leader of this ragtag group, the symbol of humanity's last effort to claw its way back from the abyss. The guilt of losing so many weighed on her, but it was tempered by the knowledge that each life they saved mattered, that their fight had meaning. Now, with everything on the line, Clara had to put aside the doubts and the pain. It was time for the final push. Marcus Kane had spent days working in the shadows, monitoring Gen X's communications, cracking their security systems and mapping out every route to their command center. His skills had been invaluable to the Resistance, but even he knew that no amount of hacking could stop the storm that was coming. The time for subtlety was over. It was time to bring the fight directly to Gen X's doorstep, to wipe out the very root of the virus that had destroyed so much of the world. Emil Stokes, the voice of the Resistance, had continued his broadcasts, fueling the flames of defiance in every corner of the world. His words had given people hope, and now that hope was needed more than ever. But Emil knew that hope could only take them so far. The enemy was closing in, and the Resistance was running out of time. Still, Emil believed that humanity had one final weapon: their refusal to give in, their unwavering will to survive. It was what had driven them this far, and it was what would see them through the final stand. The Resistance had assembled a motley force, a mixture of fighters, survivors, and refugees, who had come together with a single goal to end Gen X's reign and reclaim the world for the living. The mission was simple but perilous: break into the heart of Gen X's operations, destroy their research, and ensure that no more lives could be sacrificed in the name of control and power. It was a mission that would demand everything they had and more. As the Resistance approached Gen X's heavily guarded facility, the full weight of what they were about to do hit them. The stakes couldn't have been higher. They weren't just fighting for themselves anymore. They were fighting for the generations that would come after them, for a world that could, one day, begin to rebuild. They had no illusions about the difficulty of the task ahead. The Wardens were everywhere, their eerie intelligence making them unpredictable. Gen X's mercenaries, equipped with the latest weaponry and technology, were prepared to kill anyone who dared challenge them. But the Resistance had something that no army could anticipate resolve. Clara's plan was simple but ruthless. They would infiltrate Gen X's central compound under the cover of darkness, using every resource at their disposal to breach the perimeter. Marcus had already disabled key security systems, but the facility was still fortified, with guards stationed at every possible entry point. The Resistance knew that every second counted. If they didn't act fast, they would be caught in a firefight they couldn't win. As the team moved through the shadows, they encountered resistance from Gen X's mercenaries. The air was thick with tension as gunfire echoed through the ruins. The Wardens, sensing the disturbance, moved in to ambush them. It was a brutal battle, one that tested the resolve of every fighter. Clara, ever the strategist, directed the team with precision, using her knowledge of the terrain to outmaneuver their enemies. She fought with a ferocity that surprised even herself, driven by the need to protect what little remained of humanity. Marcus was at the heart of the action, guiding the team through the maze of corridors with his knowledge of the facility's layout. Every corner they turned, every door they breached, he was there, hacking security systems and disabling traps. But even his brilliance couldn't stop the sheer force of the Wardens. The creatures were fast and terrifyingly intelligent, coordinating their attacks to force the Resistance into tight corners. One by one, the Wardens hunted them down, their movements calculated and deadly. Despite the overwhelming odds, the Resistance pressed forward. Emil's voice, transmitted over a secure frequency, continued to broadcast, urging those still hiding to fight back. "We are the last hope," his voice crackled. "If we fall, so does humanity. But if we stand together, we can push back the darkness. We are not done yet. Not while there is still breath in our lungs. Not while there is still hope in our hearts." The final confrontation came in the heart of the facility, deep within Gen X's central command center. The Resistance had made it past the guards, past the traps, and past the infected, but they weren't prepared for what they found in the control room. It wasn't just research data they were after. It was something far more dangerous. The central control for the virus that had ravaged the world. The entire system was integrated into Gen X's command center, and destroying it would mean the complete collapse of their operation. But as they prepared to destroy the control system, the ground trembled beneath their feet. A massive explosion rocked the building, sending shockwaves through the structure. The mercenaries had found them. The wardens had arrived, and there was no way out. In that moment, Clara, Marcus, and Emile knew that this was their final stand. The battle wasn't just for survival, it was for the future. They fought with everything they had, using every ounce of strength, every weapon at their disposal, to hold off the enemy long enough for Marcus to destroy the control system. The wardens closed in, their eerie, calculating eyes locked on their prey. And then, as the resistance was about to be overwhelmed, Marcus executed the final command. The control system crashed, and the facility's infrastructure began to collapse. The virus's hold over the world began to weaken. The wardens, momentarily thrown off by the disruption, hesitated. It was then that the resistance made their escape bloodied, broken, but victorious. They had achieved the impossible. They had struck at the heart of Gen X's operations, and they had brought the war to its end. The world would never be the same, but for the first time in a long while there was hope. The final stand had been fought, and they had won. The resistance, though battered, had not fallen. Humanity's last hope had not been extinguished. The battle was over, but the war for the future was just beginning. The world was broken, but it was not beyond repair. The resistance had won the final stand.